Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. In the previous session, we began the 7th chapter, wearing bracelets, strings, etc. for removing or preventing affliction is shirk. And we made a distinction between major and minor shirk in this case. We said that it becomes major shirk under what condition?
The one who's wearing it believes that it's independent of Allah.
Right. As the brother said, if the one who wears it believes that it acts independently of Allah, that it has its own power, which is not something given by Allah. So in that case, we're dealing with major shirk. We also talked about causes and causality. How do we determine whether something is illegitimate as a means of protecting the person from evil or bringing good for the person? We said either that thing has been identified in the Sharia as a source of good or a means of protection from harm, or from human experience, human beings have concluded that this particular medicine or this particular object, etc., does in fact prevent harm or brings some good. And this is something which is consistent with the people who utilize it. Yarhamukallah. It will be consistent with the people who utilize it, meaning that it's not something which some people have experienced but many others haven't. Then we talked about the first verse which the author brought regarding Allah asking the idol worshippers or telling us to ask the idol worshippers, really telling Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to ask the idol worshippers, or his followers to ask the idol worshippers, who created the heavens and earth? They will answer Allah. And this, what we said, was to indicate that those that they're worshipping didn't create the heavens and the earth, so therefore they are not legitimate sources. They are not ones who should be turned to protect them from evil or to bring good to them or bring good for them. And we said this was the same logic used by Prophet Abraham when he destroyed the idols of the idol worshippers. There's also a narration which Ibn Kathir brings relative to this verse, in which the Prophet ﷺ identifies the same concept, put in his own words, in another way. It's an authentic narration found in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, in which he narrates from Ibn Abbas that the Prophet ﷺ had said to him, "O young man, shall I teach you some words by which Allah will benefit you?" And he replied, "Certainly." He said, "Be mindful of Allah and He will protect you. Be mindful of Allah and you will find Him with you. Turn to Allah in times of ease and He will turn to you in times of difficulty. If you ask anyone for anything, then ask Allah. If you seek help from anyone, then seek help from Allah." And here is the main point. Know that even if the entire world were to come together to do some harm to you that Allah has not decreed for you, they will never be able to do harm to you. And if they were to gather to do good for you, to do some good for you, that Allah hasn't decreed for you, they will never be able to do that. The pages have dried and the pens have been lifted. That is, that it's already been written. Strive for the sake of Allah with thankfulness and firm conviction, and know that in patiently persevering with what you dislike, there is much goodness. Victory comes with patience. A way out comes with every difficulty, and ease comes with hardships. A very important hadith for those of us who go through or are going through times of trial. Basically, everybody has something in their lives. This hadith is a good reminder for us. We also pointed out that although this verse is directed to the pagans, وَلَئِن سَأَلْتَهُمْ مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ لَيَقُولُنَّ اللَّهُ. Indeed, if you ask them who created the heavens and earth, they will say Allah. That it is, in its basic meaning, relevant to the believers in general, to all those who claim belief. We also mentioned at the end of the verse where Allah says, قُلْ حَسْبِيَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ يَتَوَكَّلُ الْمُتَوَكِّلُونَ. Say, Allah is sufficient for me. Those who trust depend on Him alone. We talked about that dua, Hasbi Allah, whether it was Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil, that Prophet Abraham was supposed to have said when being thrown in the fire, or the narration story of the woman with the child who spoke while breastfeeding. A good dua to make when one finds oneself in times of difficulty. Those who trust depend on Him alone. That trusting in Allah, this is a part of Tawheed. It is the basis of patience. Because if one doesn't have trust in Allah, you can't be patient. It's the foundation. Without it, one then blames others, depends on oneself, depends on others beyond what they should be depended upon. I mean, there's a certain level of dependence which is reasonable and logical and acceptable. You ask somebody to do a job who you think can do it, and you depend on them to do it. That is fine. But one has to, when depending on human beings, has to do so with a sense that though I'm depending on this person, they may fail me. They could fail me. So when they depend with that kind of dependence, knowing the fallibility of those who they depend on, then when those people become undependable, they break their trust, they don't fulfill what they were requested to do, then the person isn't shattered. Right? A person becomes shattered, goes into states of distress, becomes depressed and all these other kinds of things. Why? Which come out of trust. Because they have trusted people beyond the amount that they should have trusted them. So it's only Allah that we trust in, knowing that His trust will not be broken. Whether we're able to see the fulfillment of His promise in our lives or not, we have to believe that whatever Allah has promised us is true. So when we say Hasbi Allah, we're really turning over our abilities to Allah. And in the beginning of Salatul Istikhara, that's the same thing we say too. We say we ask Allah, with His knowledge, because we have no knowledge, with His power, because we have no power, and He is able to do all things. As we start our Salatul Istikhara with that. Basically, we're turning over our affair to Allah after we have made our effort the best we can to determine what is best. Then we turn the affair over to Allah and we leave the decision to Him. The next hadith, which is the hadith of Imran ibn Hussein. This hadith is basically a weak hadith. The narration which comes in the text from Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab doesn't exist. That narration does not exist. Well, we won't say fabricated, It doesn't exist. We can say he made a mistake. As a narration, for you to narrate it, it becomes a fabricated narration. So it is incorrect to make this narration, to teach it as it is, right? Because the narration is in fact a combination of two other narrations, one found in Musnad Ahmed and the other one in Sunan Ibn Majah, right? So these two narrations, either of the two are the accurate narrations, but both of them are da'if. Both of them also are weak. However, their weakness wasn't sufficient to rule them out. Where other hadiths support the meaning and the weakness is not due to fabricators in the chain, then weak hadiths coming from more than one chain can strengthen each other, and so it becomes what they call Hasan li ghayri, right? Or it is Hasan, meaning good and acceptable hadith based on other narrations, not in and of itself, right? So this was the understanding of the author, that based on the other narrations, this was an acceptable narration. Anyway, the text itself, the Prophet ﷺ once saw a man with a brass ring on his hand and asked him, "What is this?" Imran ibn Hussein doesn't mention the name of the man. Obviously not that important. The incident is what's most important. And he asked him, "What is this?" The man replied, "It is to overcome weakness." And he said, that's Prophet ﷺ said, "Remove it, for if it would only add to your weakness. And should death overtake you while you're wearing it, you would never succeed." Now, this hadith has in it a general da'wah point, a point to be used when making da'wah, and in correcting people's mistakes in general, right? The Prophet ﷺ, though he knew why the man was wearing this, brass ring, though he knew why he was wearing it, he still asked him, "What is this?" Right? Meaning, teaching us not to assume, because you see somebody doing something which you will normally associate with error, if the wrong intention is behind it, don't assume that the person has the wrong intention. Proper way of da'wah, of correcting people's errors, mistakes, etc., is to find out, give them the benefit of the doubt that perhaps it may be for another reason. So ask them, why? What is this, etc. Let them clarify. After they have clarified for you that in fact it was the wrong intention, they had the wrong reason, then you go ahead and you correct it. That this was a lesson to be drawn from this hadith. Now, according to the hadith, Prophet ﷺ said that, it would only add to his weakness. Because the weakness in the individual was not necessarily a true physical weakness, but something psychological. There's a psychological element associated with his physical weakness. Say he had some illness or whatever, and he put it on, Now he has depended on this thing, right? Psychologically, now he has put his hopes in this, which is a false means of helping himself. What happens can easily happen to him is that if he forgets to put it on, he loses it or whatever, then he becomes distressed. Where is my ring? Where is my whatever? And that only makes him weaker, because his dependence on this false means has weakened him further. So Prophet ﷺ had said that it will only increase you in weakness. Now the last statement, should death overtake you while you're wearing it, you would never succeed. Never succeed meaning what? You'll go to hell. Right? From this, the author concluded that ignorance is not an excuse. Ignorance is not an excuse. However, that has to be clarified. He puts it as point number 3 in his list of important issues, those after from his lessons that added it at the end. Point number 3, that ignorance is not an excuse. But the point is that one has to look at the circumstances of ignorance. We have enough hadiths from the Prophet ﷺ to excuse ignorance, that we don't take that as a generality, right? So we can only say relative to this individual had no excuse for his ignorance, which is why the Prophet ﷺ said that. Why do we know that? Because there are other hadiths where the Prophet ﷺ, had said that, those who, that the pen had been lifted, from, and then he listed different groups of people, among them, the person who had forgotten, a person who was immature. I mean, these are bases for states of ignorance, right? And we have the hadiths about those who would raise a complaint to Allah on the Day of Judgment. They died in old age. When the message came, they couldn't understand it, etc., etc. People whose state became a state of ignorance where they were not able to accept the message. So we know we have evidence where there are justified cases of ignorance. So as pointed out, ignorance is not excused, is the one which is the product of negligence, haughtiness, and laziness. Negligence, haughtiness, and laziness. Negligence meaning you had ample opportunity to find out, but you just neglected it. You're driving down the highway, there are signs which tell you the speed limit, and the policeman catches you, you say, I didn't notice the signs. That's negligence. They're not going to accept that excuse. Haughtiness, where, you had the opportunity, but you felt you were above it. Right? Like somebody tries to teach you something of the religion, but you're a cultural Muslim, so you say, I know the religion. Who are you to tell me? Either because it's an older person, you're a younger person, and you're doing it in a proper way, or it may be a new Muslim and a born Muslim. A new Muslim tries to explain something to a born Muslim. You just became a Muslim a while ago. What are you going to tell me about the religion? You have these kind of attitudes happening. And a variety of other circumstances where it becomes haughtiness and pride, which stops the person from getting that knowledge. Then they become responsible and held responsible by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And laziness, of course, people not making the effort. That's why the Prophet ﷺ had said, seeking knowledge is compulsory for everybody. It's compulsory. So laziness would not be accepted as an excuse. The next hadith, next narration, from Uqba ibn Amir, wherein he quoted the Prophet ﷺ as saying, "Man ta'allaqa tamimatan fala atamma Allahu lah, wa man ta'allaqa wada'atan fala wada'a Allahu lah." whoever is attached to talisman or an amulet will never see his wish fulfilled by Allah, and whoever is attached to a seashell will never find peace and rest. Well, the talisman and the amulets, we know about. The talisman, some people make some distinctions between the two. What's the difference between a talisman and an amulet? A talisman basically being something which a person wears around his neck, around his arm, whatever, to protect one from evil. It contains some kind of writing, or contains some jewel. People may wear ones which have a particular stone like this, precious stone or whatever they feel is going to be protective. Or it could be just a writing in and of itself on a paper. They have other names for them. Hijab, they call them ta'weez, the subcontinent, etc. Anyway, this hadith basically is saying that whoever is attached to the talisman, where his heart becomes attached to it, dependent on it, he will not find rest. The seashell mentioned here, this is a cowrie shell. These shells were used also in a similar way, like a talisman, believing that they would protect. In another narration from Uqba, the Prophet ﷺ is also quoted as saying, "Man allaqa tamimatan faqad ashrak." Whoever wears a talisman has committed shirk. And this is actually a part of a longer hadith in which a group of men had approached the Prophet ﷺ to give their allegiance to him, and he had accepted the oath of 9 of them and refused one, the 10th. When he was asked why he refused the 10th, he said, "Indeed, he is wearing an amulet." The man who was wearing the amulet put his hand in his cloak immediately and pulled out the amulet and broke it, and then made the oath. And the Prophet ﷺ accepted it from him and said, "Whoever wears an amulet has committed shirk." Now, of course, in the old times, the amulets were made from these kinds of products, right? In more recent times, we have much fancier versions, computer discs, and plastic, a variety of chains and things which are put on our cars, hanging in our homes, etc. Fancier versions, but the same principle is applicable. Now, most of us who do that use Quranic texts for this purpose. The issue is there any difference between a talisman which contains shirk and one which contains the Quranic text? Well, there was some difference of opinion outside of the time of the companions, and we look at that in more detail. But in reality, the same principle applies, because the Prophet ﷺ, when he said this, he didn't make a distinction or exception for any other kind of talisman. So if he just said whoever wears a talisman has committed shirk, then we have to take it in the generality unless other evidence comes to indicate otherwise. Where we looked at earlier, where the Prophet ﷺ had said, we talked about, or in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ had said about the person that he was going to hell, that we didn't conclude that this was automatically the case for anyone who was ignorant, because we had other hadiths to indicate otherwise. So similarly, in the case of the talisman, for us to say, well, no, talisman which contain shirk, these are the ones that are forbidden, then we need to have some other evidence to make that clarification. We can't say, okay, we're going to make qiyas, on other cases where the Prophet ﷺ said things and made exceptions, where he said exceptions. Right? No. We have to take each instruction on its own, unless both instructions share the same cause. Right? There's another narration from Ibn Abi Hatim, who reports that Hudhayfa once saw a man with a cord on his hand, so he cut the cord and recited the verse, وَمَا يُؤْمِنُ أَكْثَرُهُمْ بِاللَّهِ إِلَّا وَهُمْ مُشْرِكُونَ. Most of them believe in Allah and still practice shirk. Now, this athar, we could call it, or athar, it's from the athar. We don't call it a hadith because this is a statement of a sahabi as opposed to a statement of the Prophet ﷺ or something attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. This athar from Hudhayfa actually contains supportive evidence for the use of verses which may have initially been in reference to pagans, that they may be used even for those who claim to believe. Remember, I mentioned earlier that the verse, وَلَئِن سَأَلْتَهُمْ مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ لَيَقُولُنَّ اللَّهُ, that this issue, if you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they will say Allah. That this whole issue which is discussed here is applicable even to Muslims. Some people might say, no, well, why are you taking it out of context? This is in reference to the pagans. How can you do this? And you'll find even this common verse, وَمَا يُؤْمِنُ أَكْثَرُهُمْ بِاللَّهِ إِلَّا وَهُمْ مُشْرِكُونَ. Most of them believe in Allah and still practice shirk. This verse is one of the most commonly used verses to clarify that simply because a person claims that he or she believes, that doesn't mean that they are free from shirk. In fact, most people who make that claim are involved in shirk. However, when this is applied amongst the Muslims, you have those, especially from the Sufi mystical background individuals, they usually attack the people who call to this, as they call them, of course, Wahhabis and everything else. Look at them using these verses out of context. Allah is talking about the pagans, and here they are using it in reference to Muslims. Well, this athar of Hudhayfa is clear evidence of its permissibility. Because here is a companion of the Prophet ﷺ who understood the use of the Quran better than you or I. He has used it as evidence when speaking to a Muslim. So therefore, it is a legitimate piece of evidence to use. The other narration, which should be noted in this context, where people wear cord bracelets, things like this, and these are quite popular. I think this is sort of a Hindu style. They have a lot of knotted corded bracelets that they use. It's become very popular in the West, and you find even Muslim youths wearing it and things like this. Many of them are wearing it, they don't even know what it means. That's one thing. But then there are those who actually do know and do believe in somehow, some way, that it's going to bring some good for them. Well, there's a well-known narration from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud in which he came home and found his wife wearing a knotted cord necklace around her neck. And he asked her about it, and she said that a spell had been placed on it to protect her, to help her, because she was ill. And some of the other narrations, it mentions here too that her eye was twitching. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, very upset, took it away from her and destroyed it, telling her that basically what she was suffering from was the impact of the jinn. Jinn was affecting her, and when she resorted to shirk, then it left. So this also can explain some of the cases where people, come before the faith healers, and they put their hands on them or call on Jesus. Everything is done in Jesus' name anyway, and you find people being healed, etc., etc., and so much so that you even find Muslims lining up to get a bit of it. Anyway, the Abdullah ibn Abbas had narrated the hadith which Prophet ﷺ taught for illnesses, pains, etc., where one you put your hand on wherever you're suffering from and say, Allahumma adhib al-ba's, Rabb al-nas, washfi anta shafi, la shifa'a illa shifa'uk, shifa yughadiru saqama. Allahumma, O Allah, remove the suffering, O Lord of mankind, and heal me perfectly as you are the true healer. There is no cure except your cure, a cure which is not followed by sickness. The next chapter, chapter 8, Ruqa, talismans and amulets. The author doesn't refer to them as being shirk, though talisman and amulets are shirk, which he mentioned in the previous chapter, right, in some of the hadiths of the previous chapter anyway. But he didn't mention all of this as being shirk. Why? Because there's an element of ruqa which are not considered to be shirk and which the Prophet ﷺ permitted. Right? So he didn't use this general labeling of everything that was worn. In fact, Prophet ﷺ had said on one occasion, when it was reported to him that one of the companions had used Surah Al-Fatiha as a means of ruqya, and he asked him, what made you know that it is ruqya? The fact that he said that means that he has accepted its use. He has accepted its use as being valid. Otherwise, he should have told him, don't use it. Ruqya or ruqa are shirk. On another occasion, he said to the companions, present your ruqa to me, for there is no harm in ruqa which is free from shirk. So he made that distinction. So that's how we're able to say, for example, when we come to the hadith of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, in which he said, quoting the Prophet ﷺ, Inna ruqa wa tama'ima wa tiwala shirkun. Ruqa, tama'im, and tiwala are all shirk. Tiwala we took before was omens, and tama'im, these are amulets, etc. Right? All of these are shirk. And ruqa he mentions. So this hadith seems to imply that ruqa as a whole are shirk. But we have the other hadiths which make exception for them. So that's why we can step in and say this is not to be taken in its general implication. But that's only for ruqa. Tama'im and tiwala, he made no exception for them. So we only do it for ruqa. We don't say, well, since there is an exception for ruqa, we say there must be also an exception for tama'im and also for tiwala. No. The point that I mentioned earlier, that there were none among the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, most of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ opposed the use of amulets which contain verses of the Quran. The author said that he defined tama'im as objects placed around the necks of children to protect them from the effects of the evil eye. However, if the amulet contains verses of the Quran, then some of the Salaf allowed it, and some disallowed it. Ibn Mas'ud was among those who disapproved of it. Ibn Mas'ud, Ibn Abbas, Hudhayfa, they all opposed it. However, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, he was among the companions who did permit it. And you find amongst the Tabi'een some who did also permit it, like Abu Ja'far al-Baqir. And following in that tradition, Ahmad ibn Hanbal also permitted it. However, one cannot say, well, simply because some permitted it, then it should be okay. Because the idea is not, when we say we follow the Salaf, the way of the Salaf, the early generation. This doesn't mean in everything they did. Because there's some things which they did, some rulings which they made, which were incorrect. So we don't follow them in every single thing they did. If we have a particular issue on which companions spoke, for example, the issue of growing the beard, right? We have a difference of opinion today among some of the scholars. Some scholars say you should grow the beard and not cut anything from it, right? Because the hadith says, grow your beards. Let them grow fully and trim your mustaches. Okay? They say that's what the hadith says. But you have narrations of a number of Sahaba who trimmed their beards. After a fist, Abdullah ibn Umar, etc., trimmed their beards. So, what do you do with the practice of the companions here? Who are the ones who narrated the hadith, grow your beards? Does it make sense that a Sahabi who narrates that hadith is going to disobey that openly? We can understand him misunderstanding, not hearing a hadith, making a ruling, etc. But now he being the narrator of this hadith, and Abdullah ibn Umar was known to imitate the Prophet ﷺ in everything that he did. He was the imitator, known amongst the companions. Nobody else did what he did. But he used to do everything. Prophet ﷺ wore a particular turban, in a way he would do the same thing. He wore a ring on his finger, he would change the ring to his other hand, he would change it. He walked in this way, he walked that way. Cloak he got, you try and get a cloak like his, whatever. Anything the Prophet ﷺ did, he tried to do. So this companion, who was noted among all of the companions to try to imitate the Prophet ﷺ to a T, does it make sense, after all that he would narrate this hadith and then trim his beard? It's unthinkable. It is just simply unthinkable. And then you have a number of other Sahaba, there are a number of narrations that have been gathered of them doing this, trimming their beards. So now, we don't have any narration of a Sahabi growing his beard without trimming it. All we have are narrations of Sahaba trimming. So, this now becomes evidence, because we don't have a difference among them. There's no two practices. Some grew and didn't trim, some grew and trimmed. So we can say, okay, there are two practices. Those who didn't trim, it's matching the hadith text, and so we can say we'll support them over the others. No, all we have are narrations of companions trimming. So, on that circumstance, we take the opinion of the companions here. This is a valid basis. To say, no, I'm just going to take the text of the hadith, ignore the practice of the companions, this is incorrect. Because they best understood the intent of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is a different circumstance with that type of ruling. Where we now have a thing where the Prophet ﷺ, forbids amulets, says they're shirk, makes no exception. Majority of the companions toe that line. Then we have a companion who says, well, if they contain verses of the Quran, it's okay. We have a majority, we have a minority. We don't say now, well, this is a companion who held that position. Because if you do that, if you open that door, then you run into big problems. Abu Huraira used to wash his arms up to his armpits when he made wudu. Right? And when he washed his face, he would make sure water went into his eyeballs. This was Abu Huraira. The other companions didn't do this. Right? They washed to their elbows. They washed without trying to put water in their eyeballs. So now, if you're going to say this is okay, then you see the problem that you're going to put on the ummah. So we go with the majority of the Sahaba, where the majority of them held that opinion. Then you do it. Like for example, Omar and Abu Bakr, they took the position that Hajj Tamattu was inferior, shouldn't be practiced. You should do Hajj Qiran. That was their position. These two of the righteous caliphs. But the majority of the Sahaba didn't agree with them. And they narrated hadiths from the Prophet ﷺ, in which Prophet ﷺ had said, if he had known, he would have done it. And he commanded companions to do it. So here we have a difference amongst so a difference amongst the companions doesn't necessarily mean you can take anyone. So this is a problem which exists to some degree today, where you find scholars saying, or some individuals saying, a scholar held this opinion. So anything you want to do, as long as you can find a scholar who held this opinion, it becomes okay. That's one of the arguments used for music, for example, right? You have a scholar of the past, right? What's his name? Ibn Hazm, who took the position that none of the hadiths on music were authentic. So therefore it's permissible. That's the position he took. And he was a notable scholar. Though not among the major four, he was still a notable scholar in his own right. Ibn Hazm, right? So some scholars today have used that ruling of Ibn Hazm as justification for music. But hadith scholars later identified and proved that there are a body of authentic hadiths which prohibit wind and stringed instruments. So where you have the majority of scholars looking at this thing as being wrong, with evidence, not just simply majority. Because we don't just follow majority, because sometimes the majority can be wrong. But majority with evidence, minority without evidence, then what do you follow? You must follow the majority here. It's not sufficient to say, well, I'm following a scholar. No. Right? So the issue of following, if it's based on knowledge, where there's evidence proving something to the contrary, whether you're obliged to follow the evidence. Now Ibn Hazm may have gotten his reward for his ijtihad, because he made the ijtihad. But now you get a sin on you for following that ijtihad blindly, when you knew there was other rulings supported, by majority of scholars. Then you don't get that reward. You become in sin. So we don't make the exception for the tama'im, as we said, as we do in the case of ruqa, because there is no evidence to support it. Fundamentally, that's the basic reason. If a sahabi as an individual, a few sahaba permitted it, that is not enough evidence when there were majority that prohibited it. So when we have a difference like that, then we go back to our text, and our text doesn't support it. In terms of the use of the Quran, we have been given specific ways to use it. It is by reciting it, by applying its meaning, we get the benefit from it, protecting us from evil and bringing good. In order for one to wear it around one's neck, that's like a doctor, you're going to a doctor, he gives you a prescription, right? You roll it up into a little ball, you put it inside of a sack and you tie it around your neck, and you go off with your prescription. In the same way that prescription is not going to do anything for you worn around your neck, Its benefit is in reading what it says and doing what it tells you to do. Similarly, analogy can be used in reference to the Quran. And the reality is that once you open this door, you open this door that, well, Allah said in the Quran, there's a verse where Allah said, وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. I reveal of the Quran what is a cure and mercy for the believers, right? I think we talked about this a bit earlier. Allah said there is cure in it for the believers. If this means cure, you can use it any way you want to use it. As we said, bake dough in the form of verses from the Quran and, eat it, write it in saffron and wash it and drink it, and, all kinds of things you can do. Is it all okay? No, it isn't. Because the Quran, this is deen, this is revelation. We're only allowed to use this in the ways which have been prescribed. Right? Whereas honey, which Allah describes as being shifa, you want to drink it, you want to put it on your wound, you want to use it in a variety of different ways, eat it in your sandwiches, peanut butter and honey, very nice. It's okay, because this is in the physical world, and human experience has shown that this thing is beneficial in these various different ways. Whereas the Quran, we can't use it in the same light. So we should be well aware, that the competitions that have happened in the past, where people tried to make miniature Qurans, and occasionally, from year to year, you'll find a report, they found in Bangladesh or someplace in Egypt, a Quran which was, 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch, and this is like the smallest Quran in the world, and there's a big hullabaloo is made about it, and newspaper reports and all this kind of stuff. We have to know that that Quran was made to be used as an amulet, because it has no other purpose. You can't read it, you need a microscope to look down to be able to read it, so you can't even say, okay, I'm carrying it to revise my Quran with. You have to be carrying a microscope along with you every time you need to read it. It doesn't happen. This is not real. So it's fake, right? So it means that the only purpose, the only goal behind producing this was to make a talisman. So it's actually evil. It's not good, Though some people have great pride, I've got this little Quran. People take great pride in it. The author went on to say that ruqa are what are known as azaim. Evidence has been made an exception, right? Evidence has made an exception from the prohibition, what is free from shirk, right? So the author himself mentions that the prohibition which existed in the previous narrations had exceptions. The Messenger ﷺ permitted its uses in the case of the evil eye or poisonous insect bites. On page 148, actually, the teacher of Shaykh al-Uthaymeen, Sa'di, he had listed 5 evidences why Quranic amulets should be prohibited. They're worth knowing. The first, the prohibition was made in general statements with nothing to reduce its generality, is what we said. Second, blocking a path which could lead to the legalization of wearing the other forbidden types of amulets by the masses. Thirdly, the wearer may enter the toilet and other places of filth while wearing it. Fourthly, the wearer will feel it unnecessary to read the Quranic verses he wears, which is the legal use confirmed by the Prophet ﷺ. And fifthly, there has been nothing narrated from the Prophet ﷺ supporting this practice. As-Suyuti had identified three basic conditions for a ruqya or for ruqa to be acceptable. One, it must be done using Allah's words, names, or attributes, not using anything else, the name of the Prophet ﷺ, angels, the jinn, whatever. Secondly, it should be said in Arabic. Right? Secondly, it should be said in Arabic. And thirdly, there must accompany it the belief that the ruqya by itself can do nothing. It is dependent on the divine decree. The second condition of Suyuti, that it should be said in Arabic, this was a position held in the Arabic world. It's a position held in the Arabic world. So, if it were in another language, the key is that it should be intelligible. Right? What is said is intelligible. You're not saying made up words. Right? But it's intelligible, and what it's saying is acceptable Islamically. The statement of the author with regards to the permission for ruqya, he said that it is permitted in the case of the evil eye or poisonous insect bites. In the case of the evil eye, there's a tendency, to deny it in our times. People look at it as being part of suspicion. People are suspicious. In some parts of the Muslim world, like in Morocco, they use the hand of Fatima, which is a 5-fingered hand with 2 thumbs, one on either side, Or they have this blue gem, which looks like an eye with a black dot in it, that they wear to protect from the evil eye. I'll just break for the adhan here. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. The evil eye, as we said, is real. It is not superstition. Prophet ﷺ had said, "Al-aynu haqq, walau kana shay'un sabiq al-qadr, sabaqathu al-ayn." The effect of the evil eye is real. For if there were anything which could overtake destiny, it would have been the effect of the evil eye. Right? Al-aynu haqq. The evil eye is real. It was defined as the glance of a jealous person with a corrupt soul that has an effect on others. This is a Sa'di defined it that way. The issue of corrupt soul, scholars may differ with regards to that. Whether it can also be inadvertent, that a jealous look, it could be from a person without a corrupt soul, but it may be utilized through the agency of the jinn to create some harm. But as Ibn al-Qayyim points out, that's really where the source is. It's coming from the world of the jinn. It's not really the eye of the person itself, but from the world of the jinn. And Ibn al-Qayyim divides the evil eye into 2 types: evil eyes of the human and evil eyes of the jinn. And there's a narration from Salama, when she reported the Prophet ﷺ saw a girl in her house whose face had become dark and said, "Istarqu laha fa inna biha an-nadra." Recite over her ruqya, for she has the effect of the glance, called an-nadra. And they had, scholars of the past, the language, etc., had said that the nadra is from the jinn. He said that she had an evil eye caused by the glance of a jinni, which is more penetrating than the point of a spear. In terms of treatment for the evil eye, Prophet ﷺ has recommended a number of steps. narrations of hadith for ruqya, which are the legitimate ways that we can use to cure it. Recitation of Surah Al-Falaq, which contains seeking refuge from jealousy, is the obvious first. Second, drinking truffle water. Truffles are a form of mushroom like plants which grow in the forest and even grows in desert areas. It comes up from under the ground, right, as opposed to the mushroom being maybe on trees or above ground. When the water comes, it pops up, and you'll see when they collect it. It's very expensive. It's available here in the marketplace. Anyway, the Prophet ﷺ had said, truffles are a form of manna, and their water is a cure for the evil eye. Prophet ﷺ had also recommended that if you can identify the source of the evil eye, somebody comes by and looks at your child, smiles, whatever, praises the child, doesn't say mashallah or something like this, and then the child becomes ill after that. So you can see a connection here. Then he recommended that you go and get the water, let the person make wudu. And the drippings from their wudu in the basin, you take that water back and use it to bathe your child or infant or adult. Bathe with it as a means of countering the effect of the evil eye. Okay, we'll stop here. If you have any questions concerning this portion, of course, remember the assignment I gave you. I'd like you to turn that in by next week, inshallah. You have a week. You have this week. And by the second period of next week, by Wednesday coming, please turn in those assignments. And for those of you who, had poor marks or might have poor marks, the assignment is your ruqya, is your means of, taking away some of the evil of your poor marks, your bad marks. It helped to improve the quality of your results. So take advantage of it, inshallah.
On the issue of cutting the beard, some hadith that I have read is mentioned only during the time of Hajj. Are there other hadith that mention that it is done apart from Hajj?
Well, yeah, the other hadiths mentioned about the other Sahaba. Some mention Ibn Umar being in Hajj. Others don't mention Hajj. Other Sahaba mentioned outside of Hajj. So the fact that he did it on Hajj is irrelevant. And even if he did it on Hajj, that's still evidence that it's permissible. A request from the women's side to clarify, what are ruqa. Actually, I didn't really give a definition for ruqa per se. Ruqa really is some kind of incantation. There are words said over a person, like the words used by an exorcist or whatever, to remove some harm. This is called ruqa. Even the dua we said, adhib al-ba's rabbin nas, this is a form of ruqa. Reciting, the quls over a person, this is a form of ruqa. So it could involve Quran, it could be a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it could be your own statements, where you're calling on Allah, as long as it doesn't contain shirk, the Prophet ﷺ permitted it. So it is an incantation or something which you're going to recite over the person. Our brother's question, is there an optimum time? Like we know there's certain times to make dua, which are accepted between the adhan and the iqama, on Friday, the last hour on Friday, etc. When you're traveling, there are certain optimum times for making dua. Are there optimum times to make ruqa? Well, we don't have anything specific from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The Sahaba, when they were using Al-Fatiha, they used to do it in the morning and the evening, repeatedly in the morning and the evening. So one can do it, at any time. Where one is calling on Allah and looks at it as dua, also then you go into the optimum times for dua, to say these would be naturally a good time to do it, because these are the times when du'as are answered, promised.
A woman in menses do it.
Brother's question, if a woman in her menses is allowed to do it. Yes, there's nothing to prohibit it. Traditionally people might say that, culturally, no, women in her menses shouldn't do it. That they say women in their menses, shouldn't slaughter animals, or even women, period, shouldn't slaughter. Only men are allowed to slaughter animals. Some cultures, they say that women don't, not allowed. But there's no evidence to indicate that. Okay. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.